Hi Guy, welcome back. TV spoilers. Friday, January 16th, 2026. Everything began with a moment that should have felt like an ending, but instead opened the door to a new kind of fear. When Jack released the hostage, the air should have softened, breathing should have steadied, and the exchange should have closed like a temporary truce between two sides, standing at the edge of disaster. But for Nick, it wasn't an ending at all. It was only a shift in the story. The exact second he realized he had stepped into something darker where every choice stopped looking like rescue and started becoming concealment, survival, and silence at any cost. That was when Matt Clark didn't vanish into the shadows as a vague threat. He became something far worse, unconscious, heavy, and terrifyingly real, hidden in the trunk of Nick's car like living evidence. No one could pretend this was just a situation anymore. A body still breathing, still warm, still alive was a ticking clock Nick was forced to hold in his own hands. And every second that passed made him feel dirtier, more exhausted, more alone. Nick couldn't claim he didn't know what he was doing. He understood it perfectly. Shoving a human being into a trunk even temporarily, even if that person had caused chaos, even if circumstances had pushed everything past the point of clean solutions, was still a brutal violation of a line Nick once believed he would never cross. And yet what frightened him most wasn't the guilt chewing at his chest. What truly sent panic crawling up his spine was what would happen if the truth got out, especially if it reached Victor. Victor wasn't simply a strict father or a man who controlled his family through power and rules. Victor was a machine that crushed mistakes. Nick had lived long enough under that shadow to understand that if Victor learned Matt was alive, learned Matt was in Nick's trunk, learned Jack had released a hostage in exchange for something Nick had been forced to sign with the Abbotts, then everything would explode in ways no one could contain. Nick knew that sometimes the truth wasn't liberation. In Victor's hands, truth could become a sentence. So Nick chose to hide it. Not the kind of hiding done by a cold strategist playing villain, but the kind driven by a man desperate to protect what little good he still believed existed inside him. He told himself it was a short step, a temporary move to protect the bigger picture, to shield his family from another storm, to stop Victor from charging into war on instinct and making the fallout even bloodier. But the more Nick tried to reassure himself, the more he felt like he was building a cage around his own life. Secrets never stay still. They grow, they spread, they layer fear on top of fear until the pressure becomes unbearable. And in that moment, Nick understood something he didn't want to admit. He wasn't only hiding this from Victor anymore. He was hiding it from everyone he loved, especially no one from himself. Because deep down he didn't want to face how far he might be willing to go, just to keep things stable. As the car moved forward, Nick's mind split into two opposing forces pulling him apart. On one side was the instinct to do the right thing, to call the police, to hand Matt over and let the law handle what Nick should never be forced to handle alone. On the other side was fear of Victor, fear of the family shattering, fear of being exposed as a failure of a son who couldn't control the damage, and fear that if Matt woke up, if he managed to break free, if he managed to say even one sentence, Nick would lose everything in a single breath. Every time Nick glanced in the rearview mirror, every time he heard the slightest sound from behind him, his heart slammed like it was trying to break its way out. He could feel hunted even when no one followed him. He could feel a gun to his head even when none was there. Because in that moment, Nick realized he wasn't just escaping danger anymore, he was becoming the person creating it. Then Noah entered the situation like fate striking without warning. No build-up, no preparation. Noah stepped into the scene with the eyes of a son who suddenly couldn't recognize his father as simply dad anymore, but as a moving secret soaked in danger. Noah wasn't naive. He wasn't a child who would accept vague explanations. He was the kind of person who could sense an empty space in a story and refuse to leave it unfilled. He immediately noticed something wrong in Nick's face, in the way Nick dodged his gaze, in the uneven rhythm of his breathing and the stiffness in his shoulders. It wasn't the tension of a normal problem. It was the tension of a man who had signed something he didn't want anyone to know about. And Noah felt it instantly. He didn't have all the facts yet, but his instincts were sharp enough to know Nick was hiding something enormous. The argument between Nick and Noah didn't begin with shouting. It ignited through relentless questions and Nick's growing silence. Noah wanted to know why this wasn't over, why Nick was acting like someone fleeing from his own family, and why Nick refused to say clearly what had happened. Nick tried to hold control through a kind of forced hardness, as if maintaining authority would make the situation stabilize on its own. But the more Noah demanded answers, the more Nick felt trapped against the wall. The truth was that Nick wasn't only hiding this from Victor. He was hiding it from Noah Tube Cows. Noah was the one person who could see through him. In a way Victor never would. Victor would focus on outcomes, strategy, victories, and losses. Noah would look at the human being underneath, at morality, at the internal collapse that no amount of power could erase. And then Noah realized Matt was still alive. That moment struck like a blade through the room. Suspicion was no longer vague. It wasn't a gut feeling anymore. It was undeniable reality. Matt wasn't just a name in the story, not a shadow that had disappeared. He was right there, still breathing, still capable of waking up at any second. Noah wasn't only shocked by Matt's existence. He was horrified by what Nick had done with that existence, how Nick had kept it under his own control. As if Nick had placed himself in the position of judge, police, and executioner all at once. For Noah, that wasn't simply dangerous. It was proof Nick was sliding into a place Noah never wanted to believe his father could enter. Noah began asking question after question. But what made it worse was that every question revealed another one Nick couldn't answer. Noah wanted to know what happened with Jack, why Jack released the hostage, what deal Nick had signed with the Abbotts, and what the price of that deal truly was. Each question felt like a needle piercing the thin skin of Nick's secrecy. Nick's chest tightened until breathing hurt. He knew Noah wouldn't stop. Noah had seen the part Nick wanted hidden the most. Once someone sees it, the idea of keeping it quiet stops being absolute. It turns into a war. Nick didn't answer directly. He tried to steer the conversation into the territory of adult business, emergency circumstances. I'm handling it, but the more Nick used that tone, the more he exposed how fragile his control really was. Noah refused to accept it. He couldn't accept that a living person was locked in a trunk because Dad is handling it. Noah needed to know, because if he didn't know, his mind would create the worst possibilities on its own, and imagination can be far more terrifying than truth. Noah looked at Nick with a mixture of fury and devastation, like he was watching a crack in something sacred become a permanent shatter. It wasn't just anger over Nick hiding something. It was anger because Nick was becoming someone Noah didn't want to believe he could be. Nick rejected the idea of turning Matt over to the police, and that decision became the final wall between father and son. For Nick, calling the police meant reports, investigations, records, noisy, and eventually, Victor. The legal system didn't just bring justice, it brought exposure. And right now Nick feared exposure more than anything. He feared that even the smallest rumor would reach Victor, and Victor would use it to reshape the entire war, dragging Jack, the Abbotts, and everyone else into a revenge spiral with no exit. Nick didn't want his family to become a battlefield again. But what Nick refused to see, what he couldn't allow himself to see, was that he was creating a different battlefield inside his own car. A battlefield where Noah stood on the opposite side and trust was being ripped apart in real time. Noah demanded to know what Nick planned to do with Matt. And the question wasn't simple curiosity. It was an accusation. It was fear. Because if Matt wasn't going to the police, then only two possibilities remained. Nick was keeping Matt as a hostage, or Nick intended to handle Matt in his own way. Both possibilities made Noah go cold. Noah didn't want to believe his father could choose that road, but he couldn't ignore the reality lying right in front of him. Noah felt dragged into a secret that was too filthy, too huge, to danger out, something that could destroy him the moment he touched it. Nick held his ground, more through his eyes than through words. He insisted this wasn't the time to argue, that Noah had to trust him, that he was doing what had to be done. But inside Nick, nothing was as solid as he pretended. He was shaking under the weight of his own decision. He was performing control while his mind screamed in panic. Because the truth was brutal, he didn't actually have a clear plan. He only had one obsessive goal: keep this from Victor, keep the family from exploding, keep everything from collapsing right now. But right now isn't a plan. It's a delay. And Nick understood that the longer he delayed, the higher the cost would climb. Noah looked at Nick and saw the most terrifying truth of all. His father wasn't acting out of reason anymore. Nick wasn't evil. But he was cornered so completely that every choice he made smelled like desperation. Noah could see it, and it hurt worse than anger. Because when a good man begins doing morally gray things, it's the beginning of collapse. Noah didn't want to be the person who watched it happen. But he also couldn't become an accomplice. He was trapped between loyalty and moral fear, between love for his father and disgust at the line his father was crossing. So the argument wasn't only about Matt. It became about the Newman family itself. It became about whether Nick was turning into a different version of Victor, just softer on the surface, but driven by fear instead of power. It became about whether Noah could still believe his father would choose the right path, when everything got ugly. And it became about secrets, the kind that always claim they exist for a reason, but eventually destroy every relationship they touch. In that moment, the car felt like a sealed room, trapping a father, a son, an unconscious body, and a future already cracking apart. Nick felt like he was holding a bomb without knowing where the fuse was. Noah felt like he was seeing the darkest side of his family for the first time. And Matt, silent in the trunk, became the center of a storm that could swallow everyone at Abbott's, the Newmans, and the meaning of what family was ever supposed to be. When Nick refused again to call the police, Noah realized he couldn't just stand there and accept it. But Noah also couldn't run to Victor because he knew that would turn everything into hell. Noah was trapped inside an unbearable choice: keep the secret and lose himself, or expose the truth and destroy his father. Nick tightened his grip on the steering wheel and felt like he was driving straight into a tunnel, without light. And then a small, unexpected sign appeared, a faint movement in the back. A muffled sound like breath catching in a throat, freezing both Nick and Noah at the same time, because they understood the exact same thing in the exact same instant. Matt Clark might be waking up, and the moment Matt opens his eyes, this secret won't belong to Nick anymore. Sometimes I honestly wonder, in Genoa City, how much can anyone still believe in the feeling of it's finally over? Kyle sits across from Jack and talks about hope, about peace, about the idea that maybe the storm has passed at last. But even the way Kyle chooses his words feels incomplete, almost fragile, like he's trying to convince himself more than he's trying to convince his father. Watching that moment, one thought keeps echoing in my head in the most painfully human way: people say we're okay now, not because things are truly okay, but because they're too exhausted to keep panicking. And that's Kyle. He carries the pressure of a man who wants to prove he deserves to inherit Abbott, while also fearing that one wrong move could send everything the Abbotts built collapsing, like a paper tower. So when he asks Jack whether they should risk turning Abbott back on, whether they should restart the machine and move forward, it sounds like business, yes, but I can feel something deeper underneath it. It's a question about faith. Faith that the Abbott family can return to normal after everything. Faith that the shadow called Matt has been locked away somewhere and will never crawl back out, to tear their lives apart again. But Kyle can't fully believe that not true, so he adds a warning, like slamming on the brakes, like grabbing Jack by the sleeve right as he's about to step outside the thin line of safety. Matt could escape, and if Matt escapes, it won't just be trouble, it'll be devastation. Kyle doesn't need to say it outright. It's there in his eyes, in the way he presses each sentence like he's stacking stones in front of the gates of hell. Jack, as always, tries to keep his composure. There's something about Jack that makes me respect him and feel sad for him at the same time, because he always has to look steady, as if the entire family will fall apart the second he shows any weakness. Jack confirms that Matt is truly secure, and the words sound confident. But they're also the kind of confidence a man learns to speak when he's spent years soothing everyone else's fears. I don't know how much Jack believes it himself, or whether he's simply building a mental wall so Kyle doesn't break. Because the truth is, in Genoa City, nothing is ever completely safe. There are only temporary quiet stretches. And right when Jack tries to seal the conversation there, Nick appears like a cold gust, cutting straight through the room. Nick has this energy that's hard to describe. He's the kind of man who will run into fire to save someone. But he's also the kind of man who has been burned too many times to tolerate hopeful speeches anymore. He grumbles, he snaps, he calls Matt a psycho and voices the fear that Matt could escape. And I get Nick. Sometimes I even feel like Nick is the most realistic person in the room, the only one not trying to breathe through faith. Because Nick doesn't believe in everything will be fine. Nick believes in everything will get worse if we do nothing. That mindset can make him difficult, even unbearable. But it's also the thing that keeps him upright in a city where promises are paper thin. What makes it truly chilling is that Nick doesn't stop at worrying about Matt running. He starts saying specific names like he's forcing everyone to stare directly at the nightmare they don't want to picture. Claire, Nikki, Harrison. The moment Nick speaks those names, I swear the room feels darker. Because the second you name someone you love in the same breath as a threat, it becomes a curse. Nick says Matt could go after them, and he doesn't say it like it's possible. He says it like a man who has already played that horror scene in his mind 100 times. And every time it felt real enough to bleed. Claire is a Newman, Nikki is a Newman, and Harrison is a child carrying the Abbott legacy. Matt, if he gets loose, won't attack because it makes strategic sense or because it helps some corporate plot. Matt will attack because he wants to see fear. And that kind of violence, the kind born from craving control over someone else's terror, that's the kind that makes my skin crawl. I think Nick understands that, which is why he pushes Jack to hand Matt over. He wants the threat turned into something handled by the system, by the law. Buy something with a clear ending. Nick doesn't want to live with a bomb in his hands. He wants it removed from the house before it detonates. But then the conversation slips into another layer, the layer that always makes me uncomfortable about Y&R because it feels too real. Family, pride, and business are fused so tightly that no one can say this is just work anymore. Nick clearly doesn't want to talk about the Newman business mess. There's something wounded in him. Something like pride pain, because even though the Newmans are powerful and terrifying and rich, they still get dragged into endless wars. He doesn't want to say it out loud. Maybe because admitting it means admitting his family is cornered, forced to compromise instead of dominate. But Jack is different. Jack has always been the kind of man who looks directly at what other people avoid. Jack points out that they're trying to reach a deal with Victor. A deal, it's such a normal word, so calm and reasonable, but in this world, any deal with Victor Newman feels like signing a paper that might save you today and destroy you tomorrow. Jack says it like he's admitting something bitter. They don't have another option. And I can imagine Kyle feeling the weight of that, because Kyle wants to restart Abbott, wants to move forward, wants momentum, wants progress. But to move forward, they have to sit down with Victor, make peace with a man the Abbotts are almost programmed to resist. It's like trying to heal a wound using the very knife that cut you. It sounds impossible, but life forces people into impossible things. Jack knows it. Nick knows it too. And maybe that's why Nick gets angrier, because he understands he's being shoved into a corner he hates most, bargaining with people he doesn't want to owe. Then Jack gets a text and the panic on Jack's face hits like a hammer against everything they've been trying to build. I don't even need to know the exact words on the screen. The shift in Jack's expression tells me everything. The thing they fear most is still moving closer. Moments like that make my heart tighten, because Jack is not the kind of man who shows fear easily. If Jack is shaken, then this is serious. And what does Kyle feel watching his father react like that? Probably that sick drop in the stomach, that cold rush down the spine. Nick, on the other hand, will see it as proof. Proof he was right all along. They've been talking about security while standing right at the edge of a cliff. From there, the tension becomes the kind you can't step away from. Nick swears he will carry out the deal Victor couldn't. And that line, it hits me in two directions at once. Part of me feels something like respect. Another part feels a quiet ache. Because Nick has always been that man, the one who takes on what others leave unfinished, even when he doesn't want to. If Victor won't do it, Nick will. If someone has to dirty their hands to keep the family from bleeding out, Nick will step forward. But the cost of always stepping forward is eventually you get consumed by the very thing you're trying to control. Nick says that if he gets Matt, he'll promise Jack there will be no more threats. No more attacks coming from Abbott's side. It sounds like assurance, but to me, it feels like a gamble. Because Nick can't actually be 100% certain Matt won't escape, won't retaliate, won't have someone backing him in the shadows. Nick can only promise that he'll do everything he can, and in Genoa City, everything you can sometimes becomes the exact reason you lose the last clean part of yourself. The most fascinating thing is they keep talking about Matt, but what they're really talking about is their deepest fear. Kyle fears losing Abbott and failing the moment he tries to step into legacy. Jack fears the family being dragged into war again. Fears he won't be able to protect the fragile peace he's always trying to create. Nick fears Victor, fears the truth leaking out, fears the people he loves becoming targets, and fears that he'll be forced into choices he can't come back from. And me watching them, I recognize that unsettled feeling too well. It's like living through a period where things seem fine on the surface, but you can't sleep because you keep hearing wind against the door and wondering, will the storm return? Genoa City is always like that. No one is allowed to breathe out for long. No one is allowed to truly believe it's done. And maybe what haunts me the most is Harrison's name inside this story. A child. A small name spoken like a possible casualty. I hate that feeling. I hate how adult wars always find ways to touch the most innocent people. Nick doesn't say Harrison's name for dramatic effect. He says it because he's genuinely terrified. And when Nick is terrified, he becomes dangerous, not because he wants to hurt anyone, but because he'll do anything to stop harm from reaching the people he loves. That's the part that makes Nick both reliable and frightening. He can be a shield, but he can also become the kind of man who creates an even bigger secret, just to keep things quiet. I can't stop thinking about how Nick will be forced to choose between what is right and what feels safe, and in Genoa City, safety usually wins. What does Kyle see when he looks at Nick? Maybe Kyle sees a future version of himself, a man crushed by responsibility until the boundaries blur. What does Jack see in Nick? Maybe Jack sees a bitter truth. Sometimes the Abbotts need a Newman to survive, even if it injures their pride. And Nick, looking at Jack, probably feels something deeply conflicted, wanting to resent him, needing to cooperate, wanting to break this endless cycle and knowing he can't. That's one of the things that makes Y and R feel so good and so exhausting at the same time. They're enemies, but they become each other's lifeline the moment danger rises. And every time it happens, it leaves behind another crack that never fully disappears. When Nick swears he'll do what Victor couldn't, I keep wondering whether that vow is salvation or self-destructs. Nick is placing himself in the position of holding Matt. And holding someone like Matt isn't just holding a body. It's holding madness, obsession, a rage that can spill at any second. Nick believes that if he controls Matt, everything stays quiet. But I can't shake the feeling that the moment Nick finally gets Matt will be the moment real danger begins. Because when someone like Nick starts believing he can control everything, that's when he becomes most likely to make the mistake that costs him everything. And in the end, what makes this storyline impossible to walk away from? What makes me want the next episode immediately is that Jack's text doesn't feel like a simple warning. It feels like a stone thrown straight into a lake already cracked under the surface. It signals that Matt isn't as secure as they think. It hints that any deal with Victor might not be enough. It suggests that even if they try to keep all of this locked behind closed doors, something is already slipping through the cracks, already picking the locks from the inside. And I can't stop thinking about one truly terrible possibility, that while Kyle is still debating whether to reboot Abbott, while Nick is still trying to persuade Jack to hand Matt over, Matt somewhere out there has already opened his eyes, already remembered, already begun to plan. A plan that doesn't target a company but targets fear itself. And if that's true, then the question is no longer should they risk bringing Abbott back to life, but whether they can stop the next strike before it reaches the people they love. Most because once Matt truly disappears beyond anyone's control, Genoa City won't have a single safe place left. And the first blow could land when no one even has time to breathe. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.